On the night of February 1st, 1959, 9 experienced Soviet hikers died under circumstances so bizarre, so inexplicable, that more than 6 decades later, investigators, scientists, and amateur researchers still cannot agree on what happened. Their bodies were later found scattered across the snowy slopes of the northern Ural Mountains. Some were nearly naked, despite temperatures reaching -30 degrees Celsius. Their tent had been cut open from the inside. They had fled into the deadly cold barefoot and barely clothed. Some had suffered injuries so severe that a Soviet investigator compared them to victims of high-speed car crashes, yet there were no external wounds. One victim was missing her tongue and eyes. Another had catastrophic skull damage with no corresponding soft tissue trauma. The official Soviet investigation ended with an impossibly vague conclusion: death caused by a compelling natural force. The case was then classified and locked away for decades, leaving behind only unanswered questions, competing theories, and a mystery that would become one of the most haunting unsolved incidents in modern history. In January 1959, 10 people assembled in the city of Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg, preparing for an ambitious winter expedition into the northern Ural Mountains. They were all experienced hikers and skiers, most of them students or graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. This was not a casual trip. It was a Category 3 expedition, the most difficult classification in Soviet mountaineering, requiring extensive experience, physical endurance, and proven winter survival skills. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a fifth-year student in the radio engineering department. Dyatlov was known for his meticulous planning, strong leadership, and deep passion for the mountains. He had organized every detail of the journey, from the route to the equipment to emergency protocols. Among the group was Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, athletic and determined, who had joined Dyatlov on previous expeditions. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old, energetic, fearless, and outspoken, was one of the most enthusiastic members of the team. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, a quiet and methodical physics student, kept detailed notes throughout the journey. Rustem Slobodin, 23, a graduate engineer, was known for remaining calm under pressure. There were also 2 close friends, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko. Doroshenko, 21, was an economics student. Krivonischenko, 23, was a graduate engineer who had previously worked at nuclear facilities and was known for his humor and guitar playing. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, also 23, was a graduate engineer whose French surname stood out in Soviet Russia. The oldest member was Alexander Zolotaryov, 37, a World War II veteran with extensive mountaineering experience who also worked as an instructor. The 10th member was Yuri Yudin, 21, a 4th-year economics student. He would become the only survivor, not because he escaped whatever killed the others, but because he turned back early due to illness. These were not reckless amateurs. They were among the Soviet Union's most capable young outdoorsmen, prepared for extreme conditions, familiar with winter survival, and led by someone with proven experience organizing difficult expeditions. On January 25, 1959, the group boarded a train from Sverdlovsk to Ivdel, a small town at the edge of the wilderness. From there, they traveled by truck to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement before the mountains. On January 27th, they began their journey on foot and skis. Their objective was Mount Oterten, roughly 10 kilometers north of where they would ultimately die. The route was demanding, but well within their abilities. They expected to return by February 12th. The first days passed without incident, but progress was steady. The hikers took photographs, joked with one another, and kept detailed diaries. On January 28th, Yuri Yudin's condition worsened. He suffered from sciatica and joint pain that made continuing impossible. Reluctantly, he made the decision to turn back. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Yudin was the last person to see the other 9 alive. The photographs taken just before he left show a cheerful group, smiling confidently, unaware that they had only days left to live. The group's diaries and photographs allow the final days of the expedition to be reconstructed with unsettling clarity. On January 30th, the hikers reached the edge of the highland zone. There, they built a storage cache, leaving behind supplies and equipment they wouldn't need for the next stage of the journey. This was standard practice on long expeditions. It reduced weight and ensured resources would be available on the return trip. The following day, January 31st, they began ascending toward the mountain pass. Weather conditions were deteriorating. Snowfall increased and visibility dropped. According to their original plan, they should have stopped and made camp in the forest, where trees would provide protection from wind. Instead, they continued uphill. Why they chose to push forward remains unclear. Perhaps they wanted to reach the pass before conditions worsened. Perhaps Dyatlov misjudged the weather, or perhaps something else influenced their decision. They never reached the pass that day. As darkness fell and the storm intensified, the group set up their tent on the slope of a mountain known by the local Mansi people as Kholat Shachol, a name that translates to Dead Mountain. It was an exposed location, far from ideal. There were no trees for shelter, no natural windbreaks. Experienced mountaineers typically avoid such sites unless absolutely necessary. Why they chose this spot remains one of the many unanswered questions. Some believe they became disoriented in poor visibility. Others suggest they intentionally chose the slope as a training exercise in extreme conditions. That night, February 1st, 1959, something happened. Something so sudden and terrifying that 9 experienced winter hikers cut their way out of their own tent and fled into the darkness of a Siberian night. When the group failed to return by February 12th, no immediate alarm was raised. Winter expeditions often ran late due to weather, injuries, or equipment problems. But as days passed with no word, concern grew. Families contacted the Institute. Search efforts were organized. On February 20th, volunteers, students, and military personnel began searching the area where the group was expected to be. They soon located the supply cache the hikers had built on January 30th, confirming they had reached that point. From there, searchers followed the route toward the pass. On February 26th, they found the tent. The scene was deeply unsettling. The tent was partially collapsed and buried in snow. Most disturbing of all, it had been slashed open from the inside. Long cuts in the fabric showed that the occupants had forced their way out rather than using the entrance. Inside, most of the group's belongings were still there. Clothing, boots, food, equipment, personal items. Almost everything had been left behind. Whatever caused them to flee, it happened so quickly that they did not take time to dress or gather supplies. Footprints led away from the tent, heading downhill toward the forest. The tracks were visible but strangely orderly, not the chaotic scattering one might expect from people fleeing in panic. Following the trail, searchers found the first 2 bodies about 1.5 kilometers from the tent near the tree line. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were discovered beneath a large cedar tree. Both were barefoot, and wearing only underwear. Nearby were the remains of a small fire. Branches on the cedar tree were broken up to 5 meters high, indicating that someone had climbed it, possibly to look back toward the tent or scan the area. Both men had died from hypothermia, but the scene raised immediate questions. Why were they so underdressed? Why had they not returned to the tent once they managed to start a fire? What were they watching for from the tree? Over the following days, searchers found 3 more bodies between the cedar tree and the tent. Igor Dyatlov was found first, roughly 300 meters uphill from the cedar, positioned as if he had been crawling back toward the tent. He was slightly better dressed than the first 2 victims and was holding a branch in his hand, as though he had been using it for support. Not far from him, about 180 meters from the cedar, Zenaida Kolmogorova was discovered. Like Dyatlov, she appeared to have been attempting to return to the tent. She had some clothing, but not enough to survive the conditions. Between them lay Rustem Slobodin. He too seemed to be moving uphill toward the tent. Notably, he had suffered a skull fracture, a small crack in his temporal bone. The injury was not immediately fatal, but it could have impaired his ability to function. All 3 had ultimately succumbed to hypothermia. The pattern was clear. After fleeing the tent, the group had split. Some attempted to survive near the forest, while others tried to return to the shelter they had abandoned. One by one, the cold claimed them. At this point, 5 bodies had been found, but 4 members of the group were still missing. The search continued for weeks as winter slowly gave way to early spring. Snow remained deep, and the terrain was treacherous. Then, on May 4th, more than 2 months after the hikers had died, the remaining 4 bodies were finally discovered. They were found in a ravine, roughly 75 meters from the cedar tree, buried beneath nearly 4 meters of snow. From the moment they were uncovered, it was clear that these 4 deaths were different. While the first 5 hikers had primarily succumbed to hypothermia, the injuries sustained by the remaining 4 were catastrophic. Lyudmila Dubinina was found missing her tongue, eyes, parts of her lips, and facial tissue. Her chest had suffered massive trauma. Multiple ribs were broken on both sides, injuries so severe that the medical examiner stated they were comparable to those seen in high-speed car crashes. Yet there were no external bruises, no damage to the soft tissue that would normally accompany such force. Alexander Zolotaryov had suffered similar injuries. His ribs were fractured, and he had significant internal bleeding. He too was missing his eyes. He was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat, indicating that clothing had been redistributed among the survivors as they struggled to stay alive. Nikolai Thibault Brignol had suffered a devastating skull fracture. His temporal bone was crushed inward, causing severe damage to his brain. This injury alone would have been fatal, or at least immediately incapacitating. Like the others, there were no external wounds to explain the force that caused it. Alexander Kolovatov had fewer visible injuries than the others in the ravine, but he was also missing some facial tissue. His cause of death was less clear, though he too had not survived the night. These 4 hikers had lived longer than the others. They were better dressed, some wearing clothing taken from those who died first. They had likely attempted to shelter in the ravine, digging into the snow in an effort to protect themselves. But whatever happened, they ended their lives in a way that defied simple explanation. With all 9 bodies recovered, Soviet authorities intensified their investigation. The case was led by Lev Ivanov, a prosecutor with experience in serious and unusual cases. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic but straightforward incident involving hypothermia and exposure. But as Ivanov examined the evidence, the situation grew increasingly strange. The tent itself was a central mystery. It had been cut open from the inside, strongly suggesting that the hikers were escaping from something rather than being attacked from outside. Yet there were no signs of intrusion, no footprints from outsiders, no evidence of struggle. The clothing told a troubling story. Some victims wore garments taken from those who died earlier, a logical survival strategy. But the distribution was chaotic. Some wore a single shoe, others were wrapped in torn scraps of clothing. A few were almost naked. It suggested panic, confusion, or extreme urgency. The injuries were perhaps the most baffling aspect. The massive chest and skull fractures found in the ravine. Victims required tremendous force, comparable to a car crash. Yet there were no external injuries, no bruising, no broken skin, no signs of impact. It was as if the force had passed through their bodies, crushing bones while leaving soft tissue largely intact. Then there was the missing soft tissue. Dubinina's tongue and eyes, Zolotaryov's eyes, portions of Kolovatov's face. Investigators initially attributed this to scavenging animals, which was plausible given the 2-month delay before the bodies were found. But some experts noted that the selectivity was unusual. Why eyes and tongue? Why not other exposed areas? Another disturbing detail emerged during forensic analysis. Traces of radiation were found on some clothing items. The levels were not high enough to cause immediate harm, but they were elevated beyond normal background levels. This discovery would fuel speculation for decades. Investigators also examined the area around the cedar tree. The remains of a fire, the broken branches, and the arrangement of bodies suggested that at least some of the hikers had fled the tent, reached the forest, and attempted to survive while watching or waiting for something. Ivanov questioned the local Mansi people, the indigenous inhabitants of the region. They denied any involvement and were quickly cleared. They also reported seeing strange glowing lights or orbs in the sky around the time of the incident. Other witnesses supported this account. A nearby geological expedition and several meteorological observers reported seeing unusual lights in the sky during late January and early February of 1959. On May 28, 1959, Lev Ivanov officially closed the investigation. The conclusion stated that the hikers had died as a result of a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. Shortly afterward, the case file was classified. This conclusion satisfied no one. Avalanche was considered, but dismissed. The slope was not steep enough. There was no visible avalanche debris, and the distribution of bodies did not match typical avalanche victims. Animal attack was ruled out. There were no tracks, no bite marks, and the injuries did not resemble predator attacks. The vague wording of the conclusion, the sudden classification of the case, and the unexplained radiation readings all contributed to the belief that something was being hidden. And so, the theories began. Over the decades, the Dyatlov Pass Incident has generated more theories than almost any other unsolved case in history. Each attempts to explain the same set of disturbing facts, yet none fully accounts for all of them. One of the earliest theories was that the hikers were victims of a secret Soviet military experiment. During the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was actively testing weapons in remote regions of the country. Some researchers believe the hikers may have witnessed parachute mines or other experimental explosives detonating nearby. These weapons were designed to explode in midair, producing powerful shock waves capable of causing severe internal injuries without leaving obvious external wounds. Such a blast could explain the massive chest and skull trauma found in the ravine victims, as well as the absence of visible impact injuries. It might also explain the panic that caused the group to flee their tent so abruptly, and the strange lights reported in the sky by multiple witnesses. The traces of radiation found on some clothing items further fueled this theory. While the radiation levels were not lethal, they were unusual enough to raise questions. One of the hikers, Yuri Krivonishenko, had previously worked at a nuclear facility which could account for some contamination. But this explanation did not satisfy everyone. Another theory involves infrasound. In certain mountain conditions, strong winds interacting with terrain can produce low-frequency sound waves that are inaudible to humans, but capable of causing intense feelings of fear, anxiety, and disorientation. Proponents of this theory suggest that infrasound may have induced panic among the hikers, convincing them that they were in immediate danger even though no visible threat was present. This could explain why they cut their way out of the tent and fled into the freezing darkness without proper clothing. However, infrasound does not explain the severe physical injuries found on some of the bodies. Avalanche theories resurfaced repeatedly over the years, despite being dismissed by the original investigation. In 2020, Russian authorities reopened the case and concluded that a delayed slab avalanche may have occurred. According to this explanation, a small but powerful collapse of snow could have struck the tent, injuring some hikers and forcing the group to evacuate. While this theory addressed some elements of the case, critics argued that it still failed to explain others. The orderly footprints leading away from the tent, the long delay before the supposed avalanche, the unusual injury patterns, and the lack of typical avalanche debris. Other explanations veered into the extraordinary. Some believed the hikers encountered a yeti or unknown creature. This idea gained traction due to a single ambiguous photograph found on one of the cameras, though most experts dismissed it as a misinterpretation of lighting and motion blur. Others suggested extraterrestrial involvement, citing the glowing orbs seen in the sky and the unexplained radiation. While no physical evidence supports this claim, it remains popular in fringe circles. There were also more psychological interpretations. Some researchers proposed that interpersonal conflict, paranoia, or a shared hallucination may have driven the group into chaos. But this theory struggled to explain the calm, orderly nature of the footprints and the cooperative behavior suggested by shared clothing and survival attempts. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Dyatlov Pass incident is not any single theory, but the way each explanation seems to address only part of the truth. Something caused 9 highly trained hikers to abandon their shelter in extreme conditions. Something drove them into the forest. Something prevented them from returning. And something inflicted injuries that should not have been possible in such an environment. Yuri Yudin, the lone survivor who turned back early, spent the rest of his life haunted by the loss of his friends. He reviewed evidence, spoke to investigators, and followed new theories as they emerged. Yet even he admitted that none fully explained what happened. Before his death in 2013, Yudin stated that he believed the true cause of the incident would never be known. Today, the Dyatlov Pass remains a place of quiet unease. A simple monument stands in memory of the 9 hikers. The mountain no longer feels remote, yet the mystery surrounding it has only grown. The case has been reopened, reanalyzed, and reclassified multiple times. Modern technology has provided new insights, but no definitive answers. In the end, The Dyatlov Pass incident endures because it resists explanation. 9. People entered the mountains. Only one came back. And whatever happened on that frozen slope remains, even now, beyond our understanding.